Hello and welcome to the Time on Screen podcast. My name is Zach Kazan. I'm the managing editor at Worn and Wound. Really happy to be joined today by Brett Braley, Worn and Wound contributor and a return guest to the Time on Screen podcast. Brett, how's it going today?
It's good. It's really good. It's sunny. I'm ready to talk about Phantom Thread, one of my favorite films. So all around, pretty good.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's great to see you and chat with you. And we've been planning this podcast for a while. As you said, we're talking about Phantom Thread today, Paul Thomas Anderson's 2017 Daniel Day-Lewis starring movie about the world of couture fashion in 1950s England. And this has been we've been talking about making this podcast for a while. This specific recording has been scheduled and rescheduled a number of times because it's a very busy time of year for both of us. So I really appreciate you finding the time for us today, Brett.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't have missed it.
This film.
Thank you.
I guess to start the conversation about Phantom Thread, we can probably start at our initial sort of discussion about doing this podcast, because it came out of, I think, the last Time on Screen podcast we did, which was about Tar, which is still one of my favorite Time on Screen podcasts that we've ever recorded. Just a really fun conversation, because I think there are definite links between Lydia Tarr and Reynolds Woodcock, the
Absolutely.
protagonist of Phantom Thread. How do those characters kind of line up for you, just in broad strokes?
I think they're really sibling films to one another. And I think that is what attracted me to Tar, having already seen Phantom Thread. So for me, having to have a character that's so well crafted, that is fictional, is one of my favorite kinds of films. Where you really have to understand, you want to look for the Wikipedia page for Reynolds Woodcock, or you want to look for the Wikipedia page for Lydia Tarr, because they seem like such well-developed characters. And that's from a narrative perspective. I think that you can easily see connections there. But on a personal perspective, from a personality and character drive standpoint, I think that persnicketyness, that fastidiousness, that level of almost resentment for everyone around them for not rising to the level of their own expertise is a through line through both films that ultimately, in some ways, is their downfall or is the driving tension for each film. And I think that for me was obvious more on the second time I watched it. Having, seen Tar probably 6 times by now, I was able to pick up stuff more.
Yeah, they're really, they're both movies about truly obsessive people who are just singularly focused on themselves. They're egomaniacs through and through, and they just go to insane lengths to be great at their chosen fields, and they feel so real. And they're both just portrayed by performances of a lifetime, I think.
Yeah.
In each case by Cate Blanchett in Tar, and Daniel Day-Lewis in Phantom Thread. When I came out of Tar, seeing Tar the first time, I said to my friend who I saw it with, I was like, this reminded me so much of There Will Be Blood, actually, another Paul Thomas Anderson movie, and Daniel Plainview, which I think is another conversation we could have, and we'll do that podcast eventually too. And he said to me, it reminded me of Reynolds Woodcock and Phantom Thread. So I think that there's a real kind of link between Tar and some of these other movies. The Brutalist, I don't know if you've seen that, but that's another movie that kind of gets thrown into the conversation about a really kind of obsessive artistic person. And I just I really enjoy movies about characters like that. I think that there's a lot of, there's always a lot to unwrap. In a kind of an epic movie about a just this obsessed character, making art. I find that fascinating.
Absolutely. And I think to that point too is that I think there's a level of Lydia Tarr and Reynolds Woodcock that they don't have to go to the extent of obsession that they do, and they would still be successful, but they feel the need to. And I think that drive throughout the film is really, when you watch them, and especially in Phantom Thread, you see that tension is so internalized that it becomes externalized. It metastasizes in all of his relationships with people. So I find that to be exceptionally interesting. in Phantom Thread's case, but in Tar's case as well. I mean, the whole downfall when she, for lack of a better word, gets canceled and Me Too'd, you see that level of control really starts to spread almost as a fog throughout the film. And I think that having that be more pervasive and with no, for lack of a better way of saying it, no real plot, but still intriguing throughout, I think that is a real masterclass in storytelling that we don't get a lot of anymore.
Yeah, for sure. Both of the movies are very episodic. They're really they're true character studies in a lot of ways, and they just kind of like reveal more about like the character and their kind of like internal world through these like little vignettes. That that you see throughout the film. So yeah, really cool connection between Phantom Thread and Tar. Phantom Thread, of course, is it's very much its own thing. So we'll get, I think, pretty into the weeds on the film. Going forward, just a little bit of background information for folks who might not be familiar with the movie. Although I don't know why you'd be listening to a podcast about this very niche movie if you're not familiar with it. Spoiler warning, by the way. We'll be talking about all aspects of the film, including I imagine the ending. So if you don't want Phantom Thread, a movie that came out in 2017, spoiled for you in 2025, go watch Phantom Thread and then come back to this podcast. But it was released on Christmas Day 2017, then wider in January of 2018, directed by Paul Thomas Anderson, starring, as we mentioned, Daniel Day-Lewis, Vicky Krieps, and Leslie Manville. This was Daniel Day-Lewis's final film before retiring from acting, which was a pretty big kind of like part of the marketing for the movie, and it was discussed quite a bit in the just getting the critical conversation around the movie, kind of like what would his final performance be like. Apparently he's coming back though. I don't know if you heard, Brett, but he's apparently going to act in a film that his son is directing sometime in the next year or so. Are you a Daniel Day-Lewis fan? Do you have like a favorite Daniel Day-Lewis performance?
I am. So I believe that this is probably my favorite Daniel Day-Lewis film, and not because it's the most recent. I mean, there is a bias of seeing the most recent film, but
sure.
His acting career spanning back from the 80s has been phenomenal, and I think it's really hard to find an actor to take more seriously in his craft than Daniel Day-Lewis, but also provide, like you were speaking about an episodic film. I think his career is episodic as well, and now that he can pick and choose at the level that he's at, I think you see that he lines up his characters so well in these last decade or so of his career that you really see where his talents are. He's not taking a job for money. He's taking a job for the craft. And again, that almost goes back to Phantom Thread itself. Yep,
for sure. I really love this performance. I think for me, it's a tie between, maybe like a three-way tie between this film and There'll Be Blood, and I'm a big fan of Last of the Mohicans. I think he's just great in that film. Really kind of like, at this point, I think overlooked Michael Mann film. Everyone talks about Heat. We love Heat. It's a great film. Last of the Mohicans is like just a great old-fashioned kind of like action romance, like just a wonderful movie and a great performance. So shout out to Last of the Mohicans. If you haven't seen it, like it's a banger. So definitely check that out. Tell me about the first time you saw Phantom Thread. Brett, did you get a chance to see it in the theater when it was originally released, or did you have to catch it later on?
I had to catch it later on. I think I say this probably on every podcast more as an apology than anything else, but I live in rural Pennsylvania. So unless it's a Marvel movie or a Disney film, I usually doesn't come to my theaters. So I had to wait for it to hit streaming, and which is kind of awful because this movie is really tailor-made for me. I studied British literature, specifically the 1930s to the 1960s in school. The novel I wrote is set in the 1950s London. And I am a big fashion writer myself. That is a side career I have in my own life. So you would think all around this would have been a film I would have driven 2 hours to see. But it was wintertime and I probably just didn't want to get out of the house. So I waited for to stream. And I think I paused it probably 5 or 6 times, not because I was bored with it or anything, but because I wanted to just absorb the scene so fully. I think that this film, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, the wardrobe is phenomenal in the film, not just the couture side, but the actual, the everyday clothes that the characters wear. And I found myself really trying to unpack the layers of the dialogue that were there. So watching it for the first time, to answer your question, was more it was more a mental exercise and a treat than, you know, a lot of films I think that came out of 2017, 2018.
Yeah. This is an interesting movie year. I want to talk to you about kind of like how this movie performed at the Oscars and some of the movies that it was up against
Yeah.
that year, because I think this is one of those movie years where you will look back and think like, what were they doing exactly? But I mentioned to you before we started recording that the first time I saw this movie was kind of like it was sort of a strange experience. I did get a chance to see it in the theater. I went and saw it in sometime in January after it was kind of in wider release, and I saw it with a buddy of mine, and you know, we kind of always go see these kind of like, you know, higher brow Oscar type films together, and you know, because we're pretty like we're film nerds, you know, and so like, you know, he's sort of like my go-to like, you know, movie friend, and so we had like I think we thought we had a pretty good idea of what we were getting into, and you know, we were in this theater in a multiplex in our, you know, hometown, and it's filled with like middle to like upper middle aged people, a lot of women, and I think they were expecting, and we were expecting too, sort of like a straightforward, like dramatic movie or a
Yeah.
romance, and my friend and I found ourselves just like howling with laughter at times in the movie, like because it is like it is hysterical.
Truly.
And I don't think it wasn't sold as a comedy at all. But there's a case to be made that like everything that comes out of Daniel Day-Lewis's mouth in this movie is just hilarious.
Mm-hmm.
And so we felt walking out of that movie, because we were the only ones laughing at this crowd of, you know, it was a much older crowd. Just thinking that like, wow, no one's like, people are not going to get this movie. And I feel like it is kind of like a slower burn movie that has its reputation is sort of like increased and gotten a little bit better over time as people have discovered it on streaming services. It played great in the theater. Like we saw it in like in a beautiful theater with, you know, a great room to see a movie in, and you know, the production design is so meticulous. It's worth seeing in a theater if you ever get a chance. But it is also the type of movie that like finds an audience at home, I think, in our
Yeah.
kind of like modern streaming culture.
Yeah, and that is unfortunate that is like, I mean, that's an entirely different podcast on how streaming has affected, you know, how we watch movies.
Mm-hmm.
But I am happy to say that like this is one that I go back to often, and part of the reason is because, like you were saying, like prior to this podcast starting, I didn't understand it was a comedy at first, even though I knew that the lines were funny and they were delivered so seriously. I think I took it at face value. I think I took it how you had probably perceived the old ladies to take it, you know, a straight film. But watching it the last couple of times, and especially, you know, I watched this week to refresh myself, I couldn't stop laughing. Like there were just in the disdain that Daniel Day-Lewis is able to convey with his eyes is truly masterful, because, you know, I myself, I'm undiagnosed, but I probably have misophonia. And, you know, if my husband listens to this, he'll be upset to say that he does chew with his mouth open. And it has been a conversation multiple times. And I can just see myself in characters like that, where you make those little comments to make sure that both of you know how annoying the other person is, and how, as Reynolds put it, how I was admiring my own gallantry for sitting through that meal. So those little comments, you're like, to verbalize that level of disdain while still making it funny is, you know, and you have to watch it a second time to get it, I think.
Yeah. The admiring my own gallantry line is great. The line about, the tea is leaving, but the interruption is still with me. It's so good. I love in that same scene where he drops the gallantry line. It's the do you have a gun? Are you a secret agent? Like that whole thing. It's like it's so good. Yeah, he clearly has this like the character has this like both disdain and I think genuine love for the Alma character, but like you really do see that like those like multiple sides of the relationship through this sort of like sardonic kind of like, you know, the way he verbalizes his, you know, his emotions. It's just like, it's so funny throughout the movie.
Yeah. And one last point on that, I think, is like, that the silences are so deep in the dialogue too.
Mhm.
Like the moments where he is staring, or you hear Alma making a lot of noise, or where they're sitting at the table waiting for Reynolds to be upset. I think the way that the Phantom Thread does the silent moments is almost or equally as impactful as the dialogue moments. And a lot of times that gets lost in film. I think, we're of the Gilmore Girls generation where everything has to be fast and pacey
Mhm.
and, you have to keep things up. And I think that to actually sit back and let emotion stew on camera is a rare thing in the last few years. And I don't notice it as much. And I could very well be wrong, but I feel like the pauses in dialogue are almost what made it funny, but also I made myself more attracted to the film.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and it's also like it also demonstrates a big shift in Paul Thomas Anderson's style over the course of
Hmm.
his career. If you think back to like his early movies, like Boogie Nights and
Oh
Magnolia
yeah,
in particular, like those have sort of this like rapid fire pace,
it's a
and
great
like the
point.
camera's always moving, and like there's always a pop song on the soundtrack, and it's like it's just like one liner after one liner, and just lots of great dialogue. But like those movies are frenetic,
Hmm.
and Phantom Thread and The Master, and especially There Will Be Blood, and even like Licorice Pizza, his most recent movie, to a certain extent, are just a lot quieter and really like kind of take their time. And I think it's an example of a filmmaker kind of like growing into his own style. And those early movies were, I love those early movies. I love all Paul Thomas Anderson's movies, and we
Hmm.
can talk about his filmography later. But he's very much kind of like aping Scorsese in those movies and other filmmakers too. And he was doing a very good job of it, but he really like found like his voice later on, I think.
Yeah.
And when he learned to be patient and kind of like linger in those quieter moments.
Yeah, which gives me hope as an author too. My first books might not be the best, but by that seventh or eighth one, it's going to be a bestseller.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a normal, I think, kind of like um I think it's a normal thing for artists. It's like I know I look back on things I wrote at for Worn and Wound, like very early on, and sometimes I'll just like come across something like in a search or whatever, and I'll you cringe a little bit.
Oh yeah,
Hopefully you're getting better as you go along. So
you're my
um
editor. You'll let me know.
yeah. um all right, let's talk about this movie year, specifically this awards season. So this was the Shape of Water year, the
Yeah.
Guillermo del Toro movie. I don't know if you ever kind of think about, Brett, like the worst movies to win an Oscar and like play that game. Like what is the worst movie to win a Best Picture Academy Award. There's a lot of contenders. I think for me personally, The Shape of Water is up there as one of the worst movies to win Best Picture. It's pretty bad, and I love Guillermo. I'm going to mispronounce his name all this entire episode. I love Del Toro. He's a fantastic filmmaker. But The Shape of Water is just like pure kind of like Oscar bait, like dribble. It just
Yeah.
did not do it for me, and it really kind of like really had a big year this year.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So I just don't understand how they like when you look at prestige media, like I do find Phantom Thread to just be a better film. And I know it's of course subjective, but The Shape of Water just seemed at moments bizarre, which I know is Del Toro style, but also moments of like almost a saccharine nature to it
Yeah.
that is really off-putting for me as a film. I don't really like when films go too far into emotions, which probably is why I like Phantom Thread because there's hardly any emotion throughout the film.
Hmm.
But I do find that I think the way you put it, that it was Oscar bait, is exactly right. It was a film that ticked all the boxes, that was also commercial enough and weird enough that it kind of tricked the general population to think that they were being artistic.
Yeah.
When in reality, it was just kind of a big budget CGI, weird costume fish sex thing.
Yeah. Yeah. That old trope.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I learned about it in film studies.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not a movie that it doesn't really exist in like today's culture. Like you never hear anyone like talking about The Shape of Water, or rewatch it. Like it's not a movie we would ever think to do on time on screen because no one's like talking about it.
Yeah.
Phantom Thread's a movie that like if you're on like like quote unquote film Twitter, which doesn't really exist anymore because of X and whatever. But like if you're in the conversation around, like contemporary filmmaking, like people are talking about Paul Thomas Anderson movies, like, all of them, including Phantom Thread. It's still pretty relevant. People are still kind of like discovering it, uh, you know, kind of like figuring out like new reads on it. And there's
Mhm.
nothing going on with The Shape of Water. It like kind of doesn't exist in movie culture. Um, the other big award that I think Phantom Thread was really passed over for was Best Actor. Of course, Daniel
Mhm.
Day Lewis was nominated. Gary Oldman won for Darkest Hour. He plays Winston Churchill in Darkest Hour. Kind of a old fashioned sort of like, this is my Oscar moment kind
Yeah.
of performance. Lots of makeup. I don't have anything bad to say about Gary Oldman. I haven't seen The Darkest Hour since like 2017 or 2018, when it was in theaters. But this is another case of like similar to Tar, a kind of like generational performance,
Mhm.
from one of our great actors. And I don't know that you could necessarily say the same thing about Oldman's performance in The Darkest Hour.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I feel like when someone is portraying Winston Churchill, that's going to be the peak of their career. But also, like the menopause of a male actor's career is to hit that Winston Churchill moment.
Yes.
Once you become Winston Churchill, you're just going to take B parts and come in once in a while and just have your headline moment on film. And I mean, I think that kind of happened with Gary Oldham as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. It did win one Academy Award, well deserved. Best costume design, Mark Bridges. So let's talk about the clothing in this movie. I don't really know too much about like the couture like culture in like mid century London, but I know that like obviously like all of the clothing in this movie is like immaculately designed. Like you mentioned, just sort of like the casual clothing that Daniel Day Lewis is wearing
Mhm.
throughout the movie. Like literally everything he wears looks great. Um, it's sort of like I'm not like a menswear guy,
Mhm.
per se. But I mean, you could do worse than kind of like emulating
Yeah.
what Daniel Day Lewis is wearing in this movie. But speak on the clothes a little bit. What was your kind of like impression of what these characters are wearing throughout the film? Because I know that was something we talked a lot about in Tar too.
Mhm.
And there's like kind of that's another like link these movies have, I think.
Absolutely. And so first I'll say it's very easy to look good in anything when you're Daniel Day-Lewis. Like just by
Fair,
his
yeah.
general body shape, clothes are going to fall off of him nicely. But I think for each character, I think a lot of times when we look at wardrobe, we think, what is this representing? And I think that that is a very low-hanging fruit. I think that wardrobe is of course going to tell the story and be a visual representation of the character, and by extension, the tension between it. We of course see Alma grow into herself, and towards the end of the film, she is talking about kind of the future, and you see her almost emulating Reynolds's clothes as well, with a vest and button-down shirt. So of course
Mhm.
that's one layer, but I think another layer to that is just the verisimilitude of seeing these characters in 1950s London clothing at a level that is upper class, or upper middle class, but at the same time not nobility, not upper class. You see a distinction between that. These people still have to work. The clothes still have to be functional. They should be layered. You see a lot of, especially with Daniel Day-Lewis and his country outfits, when they're on their honeymoon too, you see a level of functionality to their wardrobe that I
Mhm.
think has two components to it. One, that they have to do these things themselves. We don't really see Reynolds to any extent have, a valet or, a driver. He loves to drive himself. And number two is that he understands bodily what his clothes function as, and that comes from a couturier background. So I think you can always take wardrobe at face value to say this character is growing, this character is rich, this character is poor, this is a man, this is a woman. But when you look at the characters themselves, I think you get a little deeper meaning in this film than maybe anything else, like The Darkest Hour, let's say, which would have taken place at a similar time period too.
Yeah.
What we're doing, I think, with the Phantom Thread is showing that the wardrobe really is showing a class difference and a operational difference that isn't just symbolism. It goes a little bit beyond that. Now, with all that being said, they just look great. The
Yeah.
clothes just look phenomenal. The sweaters are every knitwear in this film is phenomenal. They also have this interesting way that isn't done a lot. It's very hard to do, I think, with any kind of prop, is make something look old, but also of the time. Like you
Hmm.
can't just go to a vintage store and pick up a notebook or a fountain pen, let's say in my world, and make it look old and contemporary to the film, but also you want it to register as 70 years old, right? That's hard to do, I think, but they were able to do it with the knitwear, especially where they made it look handmade. They made it look from the 1950s, but it was probably brand new too, of course, manufactured of today. So just the costume design functionality and its placement within the contemporaneous time period, I find really interesting in this film that I think is is pretty hard to emulate in other films. And Tar does it really well too, but it of course is, it's a modern film. It's set in
Sure.
2020s, I'm sure.
Yeah. No, I love what you said about the that feeling of authenticity. Like you never believe that you never think that you're just looking at like clothing as a prop. It feels really lived in.
Yeah,
Like I'm picturing in my head like The Darkest Hour and like you know like it's a really good point that like those movies take place in like the same general era. But if you watch that movie, I'm guessing just based on my recollection, like it probably looks like just like Gary Oldman's picking a suit out of off of a rack of
hmm,
suits that kind of look like they were made in the 1930s or 40s. um this is just much more it just feels much more authentic. And I love that like the camera kind of like lingers on the clothing
hmm,
in like a really like pretty obvious way. Like you see the texture of the clothing, like you really kind of like understand the layers. um and I think that's important too, because it's a movie about a guy whose life is making clothes. So I think that it's
exactly.
like it makes sense that you would be like aware of that in every in like really really like every moment of the movie, like scene to scene.
Absolutely. And two, I wrote in my notes that like for the rubric for this podcast was that we're watching a film that doesn't have costumes, it has wardrobe. And I think there's a
Hmm.
huge difference between that.
Yeah.
Like you said, there's an authenticity to it. But I think what a lot of British homes, and when he goes to his country house, you see this especially, there is this deep layering of colors and textures and fabrics. And I think that is just we spoke about this a little bit, that Anderson does a really good job of just getting that little bit extra to make it feel like you're in Britain. And
Hmm.
I think that his placement in the way that he does the curtains and how it matches or mismatches Alma. And Alma's, at the beginning she was just a waitress and then became, this couturier's wife and then couturier herself, perhaps. I think there is this level of you're placed within whatever world he allows you to be in.
Yep.
But like you said, there's always at the periphery, the camera is looking a little bit beyond that. What are the curtains doing? What is the napkin doing? And I,
Yep.
I think that all together makes this, a little more real.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of like very specific detail. It feels very well researched. I was thinking about like his breakfast order and that
Yeah.
first like that first meeting with Alma, like the Welsh rarebit specifically, like that is like such a British thing, and like
Hmm.
a very like old fashioned British thing. And of course like the scones and the particular condiments that he orders, and like it all feels like very yeah, like I mean the only word is authentic. It just feels like
Hmm.
very real and lived in. And I mean the food, like the food becomes a very important you know piece of the story as everything goes on. But like that's also something that feels very British in this movie, like the preferences for the way his asparagus is prepared and
Yeah.
other things. It's just like it all helps to kind of make it make it feel real. I wanted to so I made a list when I was rewatching this movie last night of ways that I identify with the Reynolds Woodcock character. So if you can indulge me a minute, and maybe you can tell me if you agree or disagree with any of these things, and if maybe you identify with these as well. So, I like A Quiet Breakfast.
Hmm.
I think that that's like a very like that's a very important way to start the day. I don't like if I'm gonna like go out to eat solo, I'll go out to eat solo like any meal. But like the one where like it really has to be solo is breakfast. I don't
Mm.
want to like have like a big conversation over breakfast. I really understand his like sensitivity to like all these noises, like the clattering of plates and everything. Like that's just not how I want to start my day. I want a quiet, leisurely breakfast. Maybe I'll listen to a podcast, maybe I won't,
Mm.
but I like a quiet breakfast where I'm not interrupted. Um, he doesn't love being in front of the camera. I noted that
Yeah.
in the scene, the montage scene where Alma's kind of having her moment, and there's a photo shoot of her in her gown, and he's kind of like seated admiring her, and he's just like very very uncomfortable. And I had flashbacks to like many instances of like me being on camera in the Warner Brown studio. Like
Yeah.
I'm still not used to that. I'm getting better. I hope, but like I still don't feel like that's quite my wheelhouse. So like I relate to Reynolds Woodcock there, not wanting to be on camera all the time. Also, hates going out on New Year's Eve. Doesn't want to go out on New
Yeah.
Year's Eve. That's the worst night to go out. So yeah, I'm with him there. Hard pass on going out dancing or doing anything on New Year's Eve. What do you think, Brett? Are we all just kind of like Reynolds Woodcocks, just sort of like in hiding here? They
Oh,
seem pretty relatable to me.
absolutely. I think the difference is that he can get away with it because he's successful
Yeah,
and everyone, like, princesses are coming to him and stuff. I think if I do it, I come off, kind of like, an asshole. So, but when
yeah,
he does it, it's cool. But I mean, I'm with you on the quiet mornings. I need total silence. I need silence most of the day. I'm in my office now. I rent an office outside of my house because I have dogs. I have a husband. I just need to get away from all of them. But about a week ago, I told my husband that he yawns too loudly in the morning. And if he tried to swallow it, I wouldn't hear it. So I definitely think that that's something, that we're working through right now.
yeah. That's a Reynolds Woodcockian kind of yeah,
Yeah,
kind of thing to say. I think that you're yawning too loudly. That's
it is very loud though.
yeah.
It's
No,
it's all
I believe
a
you.
higher pitch too, which
Yeah,
I don't understand that.
yeah. Um, let's talk about like our kind of like favorite scenes in the film. A couple that I had noted, that first meeting between Reynolds and Alma in the restaurant. I do love that breakfast order scene. You kind of see Reynolds at like his most playful, I
Hmm.
think, in that scene. He's obviously just like very taken by her. I love the way he places this very uh large breakfast order and then asks if she'll remember it and
Hmm.
takes the ticket from her. I think that's a great scene. Also, like every other breakfast scene, there's a bunch of breakfast scenes in this movie. Like they're all like incredibly good. Especially that first one with the woman, I think her name's Joanna, who you like see once and then never again. And she like she makes this kind of like plea to Reynolds, and like the death stare that she gets from
Yeah.
Cyril, Reynolds' sister, uh, is just like you know immediately kind of like what's going on with this character, and that like he just is someone who can't be disturbed and has this like weird sort of like predilection about silence at breakfast, which is not unusual at all, as we pointed
Yeah.
out. But yeah,
Uh, I think for me that you have it listed as well, but the asparagus conversation when
yeah,
Alma tries to like surprise him with a dinner and everything. I think on one level we've discussed how funny it is. I really love that line, admiring my own gallantry. I just think that's such a brilliant way of putting it. But there's also a sweetness to it that I think gets lost because of Reynolds's anger towards her. I mean, of course, Alma is kind of warned about this dinner, from Cyril, like
yes,
in no uncertain terms, I'll put it that way. But Alma's headstrong and wants to do it herself, and kind of been the arc of Reynolds to her, which we can discuss that in a little bit if that actually happens. But I think that there's this sweetness and this sadness to Alma just constantly apologizing too. She says the wrong things continuously, and I don't think all the time that she knows her place and that's to have unsure footing in any situation is scary, but to have unsure footing with someone like Reynolds is probably terrifying. And you can see she's constantly apologizing and then reassuring and then asking, "Are you okay? Are we okay? What are we?" And then at the end still, at those moments not human, and then her humanity comes out, and
Mm-hmm.
he can't take that. He cannot have her be a real person. And you see this again and again at one scene. I think with I think her name was Lady Baltimore. She says, "Oh, I feel so sorry for you. It's like being married to a toddler," all because Alma showed a little bit of emotion.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that cutting off at the knees that I think is so human in this film. And so while the one layer of the asparagus argument, we'll call it, is just funny and plays well and it's great acting, on another scene, it's the underbelly of their relationship, I think, is in full force there.
Yeah, that scene's really kind of I think a turning point for
Mm-hmm.
them, because I think up until then, Alma has like a sort of like confidence in thinking that she can sort of like that she can manage Reynolds, and
Yeah.
that she can care for him and have this sort of relationship with him that she wants to on her terms, and she won't have to make the types of concessions that she like Reynolds ultimately would insist that she make. I think about that. There's an early scene where where Alma is wearing a dress with some fabric that she has a question about or that she doesn't like, and she makes a comment to Reynolds as if they're equals,
Yeah.
like she just says like, I don't like this fabric, or something to that effect, and Reynolds is like, well, it's a very fine fabric and maybe you don't have very good taste. And
Yeah.
then she kind of like, she keeps kind of like pushing a little bit until he's finally just like, shut up.
Yeah.
And then like the scene ends and you realize like the mistake that she made was thinking that they're like on an equal playing field, and she continues to do that really up until that asparagus moment where she plans this elaborate evening out, evening in rather, as if she would have any like say at what Reynolds does, and it's in the evening hours. And then after that, like things really begin to shift, and she still tries to, she figures out a way to kind of like to get into his life by poisoning him, literally. That's like, that's the commentary. That's the only way she can do it, is by kind of like poisoning him with these mushrooms. So yeah, that asparagus argument is like, I think that's sort of like what the movie kind of like hinges on in terms of their relationship. I can just watch that scene over and over again just because of the dialogue is just like so good. Like every line from Daniel Day-Lewis is just amazing.
Absolutely. And the one point I wanted to make with Alma too, I think there's an underlying that isn't talked about, and I'm still developing as I go, but I think there's an underlying like othering of her because of her accent, because of I don't know if she's supposed to be German. She's Luxembourgish in real life, but I'm not sure if she's supposed to be German in the film. But I think there's also a level of othering, and I wonder there in that scene particularly where she can't get the words right, and I wonder if that is because she's translating, and we hear again with that Lady Baltimore talking about like, well, I don't want to be racist, but about she's supposed to steal or something. I can't remember the exact line. So I do think that like any vulnerability, perceived or otherwise, in that moment is where we really start seeing like, oh, she's just not of this world, and what does she owe Reynolds in that space? And
what do you think he sees in her? Like, is it just a physical attraction, or is it, because like you're right that she's not of his social class. You see the that very, like in that early scene with Joanna, this other woman who's I think maybe we're led to believe might be more like on an equal playing field with him in terms of class. Do you have any thoughts on why he's drawn to her beyond just sort of like, an artist needs his muse, and that's sort of, that's reason enough?
I think about this, and I think about the casting for Vicky Creeks in particular, and I think they go hand in hand, and I think it's because her face is really stoic. It's a mask. She's very good at that, and so I think that there's I'm going to go a bit into a grand explanation here.
Please go for it.
I think that what we're watching with Phantom Thread is a reversal of Pygmalion, this the Greek story about a sculptor that falls in love with his sculpture, and ultimately she comes to life and they get married and stuff. And I think what we're seeing is a perversion of that. So I think with Vicky Krieg's ability to just hold her face, and she has different lines where she talks about her physical endurance. She talks about, don't have a staring contest with me, you will lose. No one can stand as long as I can. She makes these little comments that punctuate it. I think that really what she's saying is, she is a statue. She is able to just stand there and take it. And I think that is intentional in Vicky Kriegs's casting. So I think, to answer your question, what I see is that Daniel Day-Lewis, or I'm sorry, Reynolds Woodcock is seeing himself in her as a reflection of himself, or putting his feelings onto her, and she's able to take that. So she can be this, this dark mirror, but also a well to whatever he throws at her. And again, we hinge back on this asparagus argument. This is where we see that crack. This is where we see that she is actually flesh and not marble.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. It's something that I've as many times as I've seen this movie, and I've seen it a bunch of times. It's something that I trip on from time to time, because it does seem sort of like a strange pairing, in a lot of ways. I think the Pygmalion comparison is a good one, sort of the reverse of that. What do you think of Vicky Krieps' performance in the movie? I was not familiar with her before this film. I think she's great. In the movie, she kind of does exactly what she needs to do in that role.
I find her enthralling, and I can't put it any other way. Like, she is not, and I say this in a good way, she's not classically what you'd see in a Hollywood actress. Her acting is a little robotic, and I think that's intentional. I do for this role, like my theory or my discussion I just talked about with Pygmalion. And I think that her ability to just take those long pauses and also be human in those roles, like when she lifts the water up and you hear it pour a little higher on the teapot, or she eats kind of really manually. I think that seems so more realistic. It doesn't feel like she's acting, and I think that's a naturalistic approach that you would get almost. I don't know her career particularly, but I think she's kind of her IMDb isn't going back to the 80s, of course,
right.
But I think that there is that level of non-jadedness to her acting that I think is brilliant for this film. I've not seen her in anything else, but I would be happy to.
Yeah, honestly, I don't think I've seen her in anything else either, unless she was in something that it just didn't register that was that's she's from Phantom Thread. But yeah, no, it's very it's one of those performances that just kind of I think it honestly it speaks to Paul Thomas Anderson and his team's kind of good taste and ability to know exactly the sort of actor that they need for a role. Because yeah, she's excellent. She's quite perfect for the role. It's hard to imagine another actress kind of doing exactly what she's doing, and part of that I think is because of the fact that she's not famous. Anyone else I think would kind of or I should say a more famous actress would sort of bring that baggage of fame, into the role. And that's something that Daniel Day-Lewis does effectively, I think, in his portrayal of Reynolds Woodcock, because you kind of understand what you're getting with the Daniel Day-Lewis performance. You're getting a certain amount of theatricality. You're getting, a method actor who's going to convincingly, pantomime the making of a dress, because he learned how to make a dress.
Yeah.
In the course of the production of this movie. So yeah, I think it's really a compliment to Anderson more than anything, that it all sort of comes together the way it does.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Another scene that I wanted to single out, because this one really on a rewatch in particular sticks out to me, is the whole Barbara Rose sequence where Reynolds Woodcock has to dress this woman for her wedding, who is kind of a sort of a detestable figure. He doesn't like her, but it's inferred that she is sort of the one paying for everything. She's his essentially his best client. And there's this great sequence that is it almost plays out like a horror movie,
Hmm.
where she gets like quite drunk at an event. I'm not sure if it's her wedding or if it's like another event, like kind of like ancillary to her wedding, but she gets like very drunk in one of his dresses, and they have to go and find her, and she falls asleep in the dress, and like the shock on his face when he realizes that she's asleep in the dress is one of the film's kind of like funnier moments. But um I like that scene, that whole sequence, because it sort of like reveals a little bit about how like the sausage is made and like how these people live. And
Hmm.
it kind of relates. There's a lot of things in this movie that relates to sort of like the watch industry in my mind, and how how watchmakers exist and sustain themselves. But like it really is sometimes like a client to client relationship. And this idea of being like a patron of these like crafts is really important in sustaining them, even if you don't particularly like the person
Yeah.
who's sustaining you. So
Yeah, that scene is so interesting to me. And right before that, I wrote down as well when Barbara Rose says, like she's before they, have the wedding, she's in the dress and they're doing the fitting, and she says, like there's nothing you can do. I'm so ugly. There, you can't
mhm.
fix this. And I think that like he completely glazes over that. He doesn't care about her feelings at all, and I love that moment, only because I think it says so much about how, like you were saying, you're just a client. Like, I have to get through this meeting. I have to
Yeah.
pin this. Don't touch it. Like, let's just, neither one of us are happy here in front of the mirror. But I second to that, when Daniel Day-Lewis, and Alma, they go into the hotel room. They say, I'm going to take this off. I'm going to go in, or you're going to have to go in. One of us is going to get this dress off of her, because we're not going to, lower ourselves to this level. We're not going to have our dress just be slept in. And after that, you see just how ecstatic and how funny. And it's like this inside joke between Alma and Reynolds together on the streets of London.
Mhm.
And I think that that's I wonder what that bonding moment is. Is it that they now feel that they're better than this really rich person? Is it that they have one up on her? Is it that they just kind of did something that, like, I can't believe we did that? I can't quite figure out what the joy is in what they did.
Yeah, it's a little strange if you like step back and like really try to dissect it. I feel like it's I don't know, just like a camaraderie, I think, in understanding that like this person is sort of like they find something about like disliking her to like
Hmm.
it sort of like brings them together in a way. It's a way for Alma, I think, maybe to like get closer to him. Like she's visibly upset, like at the dinner
Yeah.
when when she's like too drunk to kind of like sit up straight or whatever. And she literally says, I think, like it's a disgrace that she's like behaving like this in your clothing. And I think it's just like a bonding moment for them over this sort of like a shared like distaste for this person. I think Alma maybe knows she can like score some points
Yeah.
with him by by sort of like latching on to that feeling that he has towards Barbara Rose.
Oh yeah, and I'm sure it's been a long time coming on Reynolds' part to do
Yeah.
something, like, because I don't think there was any love lost. I think it was a pride thing, for him as well, but I don't think there was any love lost that Barbara Rose wasn't embarrassed.
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. Any other scenes stand out to you, Brett, that you wanted to single out?
I think what I think we have to get towards the ending now. I think
Yeah,
the
yeah,
the
yeah.
actual poisoning, because the ending is, I when so to give a little background for those who haven't seen it in a while, they get closer by Alma continuing to poison him, basically.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And of course, he becomes kind of like an invalid, and then she can take care of him. Reynolds definitely has some mommy issues, which I think then goes into my theory about Oedipus and how it's a perversion of Oedipus. I'm all over the place with Greek myths today, but I do think that she, at the very last scene, she has these mushrooms. They're at their country house, and they're poison mushrooms. And we see that Reynolds takes a bite, and Alma basically admits, I like you when you're kind of weak, and then, I can take care of you. And he takes the bite and he swallows it, and then he says, kiss me before I get sick. And that's the most in love you see him, is when he is in the bathroom
Yeah.
about to throw up. And that scene, like I was saying at the very beginning of this, I paused it, rewound, watched it, paused it, rewound, and watched it over when I first watched it, the film. And it's just this level of surrendering that Reynolds does to this life, where he's going, like, the only way that they can be together, the only way that he can function, is to have these periods of poison, these periods where it's just a pause for a system, and then, he can be taken care of. And I don't know. I just find that scene so interesting. And the fact that is the last scene before, she kind of has her little fantasy part at the end, is it leaves almost on this cliffhanger that is still wrapped up. It's a very interesting way he did it.
It's a very so the first time I saw this movie, I remember thinking, I remember being, it feels like a twist ending, that's sort of like thrust on you, like, and again, like the way that like it's shot as she's cutting those mushrooms and adding them to the omelet. First of all, like, it makes me hungry every time. Like, I really, like, it just makes me like want to like make an omelet with like a ton of butter, and just like it just looks great,
it
poison
does
or not. But it's like, it's shot like a horror movie, like the way that he's kind of like gazing at her, and the way she's looking back, and then like the insert shots with the with the preparation of the eggs and the mushrooms. And there's just like, there's this anticipation of like, does he fully realize, does he understand, is she gonna kill him, like what's going on? And again, this is like one of those scenes that I know that the like the old ladies in that audience, when I first saw this movie in like 2018, like they were like not prepared for that. And I love also that, like, that smash cut to the bathroom, like he's literally like sitting, is he like literally on a toilet, like in that scene?
I think
like,
so, because he's like, shut the door behind you.
yeah, it's just like, that's very funny to me, because the entire movie, there's this elegance, and everything is just like so, like mannered and luxurious, and then like you end up in a bathroom with these characters. It's just, I find that very amusing.
But you see, like, earlier in the film, he says, I would never get married. I'm a confirmed bachelor, because marriage, I think he says, like, marriage would change me, or marriage, I would be it would be inauthentic for me to be married or something. So we see in that moment, like, marriage does change him. Like, he's, he goes back to his kind of, regular, he's not refined. Not everything is I think Alma calls it a game at one point. He's as animalistic and as humanistic as he's ever been at the very last moment on the toilet with his wife, who poisoned him 5 minutes ago. It's just fascinating.
And who will continue to do that. And like, she's like, the movie's structured around Alma having this conversation with a doctor, and she's explaining to the doctor, that, why she does this, basically, and that she'll continue to do it. And it's just like, it's their kink, it's their like, it's their thing. And I think, like, the first time I saw the movie, like, that was my reading of it, is that like, oh, this is about like kink and relationships, and like how, like, couples find that, like in certain ways over time. And and I don't think, I think that's like a surface. I think this movie's a lot deeper than that, and it's not, it's not just about that, but it's partially about that. And again, it just like, it's not, that's not what's on the tin, like that's not what you're expecting, when you jump into this movie. And I think that's one of the cool things about it, is that, like, you hear, very early on, Paul Thomas Anderson is making a movie about, couture, 1950s London, starring Daniel Day-Lewis. Like, what could that be about? Is that a drama? Is it a romance? Like, well, actually, no, it's about this woman who's like gonna like poison him, over and over again for the rest of their lives, and how they find happiness there. It's very strange.
It is.
And one of the things I love about the movie is like how like deeply strange it actually is.
I know. And when you put it like that, like under the framework of kink, I think that's really fascinating, because I didn't read it that at all. I didn't read any kind of sexual undertones to it. I read it completely as like, the only way for that train to stop was to get off the tracks. Like, there had to be a level, like, where Reynolds had to be physically taken out of his routine and put and paused in bed or, you know, on the toilet. And that was the only way that he could ever just breathe. And to be, then, you know, he obviously reverts back to being a kid, which then I think
Yeah.
he, you know, there's this deep longing for his mother again.
Yep.
So, and I just read it really as this almost psychological perspective, like the end result of years of constraint. But I think, you know, reading it under a psychosexual reading, I think really adds a different layer to it that is really interesting, you know, compared to just saying, you know, well, you know, that's their thing, you know, that's just
Yeah.
how it is. So
I mean, that's just kind of, that's, I'll be honest, like that's a product of like me watching Paul Thomas Anderson movies for years. 'Cause,
yeah,
like they're all about sex. Like, you know, that's sort of like one of the
Boogie Nights
great
is about
themes of his.
sex. I didn't I didn't pick that one up either.
That's like, I mean, like all of his movies have these like, they're both like overtones and undertones
Oh
of
yeah,
like, you know, sexual content and like sexual manners. And it's just like, I mean, books have been written literally about like, you
yeah.
know, how like sex is portrayed in Paul Thomas Anderson movies. So yeah, that's just like me kind of like maybe like looking for it. But I think you're right. Like it is like fundamentally like a psychological, you know, thing, you know, between the two of them for sure.
But I did understand that Paul Thomas Anderson's inspiration for this, at least partially, was Maya Rudolph taking care of him too.
Mhm.
So I think there is that level. There's definitely that level of sexuality presented in it. I would just really be curious to talk to Maya Rudolph separately and be like, what did you
Sure.
think of that? What
Yeah.
are you thinking of this one?
Yeah, for sure. What are your? I gather you're a Paul Thomas Anderson fan. Where do you feel Phantom Thread kind of like lives in his filmography? Like, is it like near the top, or like how would you rank it? And what are your favorite PTA?
Yeah, so I do worry that there is a recency bias here, but I do have to say Phantom Thread really does tick every box for me. As I mentioned, you know, set in the time period I studied, set where my novel takes place, talking about fashion. Daniel Day-Lewis is one of my favorite actors. So all of that kind of encompasses that. I do find this to rise to the top. I do think that There Will Be Blood as well is, you know, just phenomenal for all the reasons that basically everyone has always talked about, again,
Yep.
for Daniel Day-Lewis's acting. But I have to say, actually, Boogie Nights is up there for me. I know it's kind of in that, like, that period of like, what was it, 1997 or 8 maybe?
Boogie Nights was 97.
And so it has that level of like that 90s grit to it. You know, they were kind of like throwing things at it. I'm not a big Mark Wahlberg fan, I have to be honest with you. But I think that was my first exposure to an adult film that wasn't an adult film. So you kind of had that level of, you know, feeling grown up watching it. And there is, like in all Paul Thomas Anderson movies, there is that level of both sexuality that you discussed and this really deep darkness in each character. And I think, because I think I watched it probably when I was 12 or 13, like you know, a censored version on like TNT or TBS or something. And I think that
a great way to watch Boogie Nights.
Yeah, I know. I was like, I didn't fully understand it because it was so disjointed. I'll put it that way.
Right.
So many things were edited out. But I think that was my first understanding of what a movie could be that wasn't a kid's movie, you know, or a movie I'd see with my parents that was PG-13, you know. And I think the narrative structures that you've talked about and the themes you've talked about, the sexuality, the tension between characters, and honestly the darkness of each character that's just underneath the surface that you almost don't see. I think those kind of round out my top three. And then you got like Licorice Pizza was a fine film too. You know, you kind of can run down the list of any of them. Magnolia also, you know, I think I've seen that probably twice. It's been a few years, but I think I liked it when I saw it.
Yeah. Listen, there honestly isn't a Paul Thomas Anderson movie I don't really love. You know, he's probably, you know, it's between him and David Fincher. Like they're probably like, you know, neck and neck for my favorite kind of like living and working, at least American filmmakers. Like they're both just like incredibly consistent, and they make, you know, almost, you know, universally just like fantastic movies. Phantom Thread's definitely like top tier PTA for me.
Yeah.
Like if you were to ask my favorite on most days, it would probably, my answer would probably either be There Will Be Blood or The Master. The Master for me is one of those movies that like, I just feel like I'll never quite crack. And that's one of like my favorite things about a movie is like that I can watch it over and over and over again and like never fully kind of grasp it.
Yeah.
And I love that about it. I love how there's really like no real explanation for it that like is completely satisfying. And there's great performances in it too. Obviously, Philip Seymour Hoffman and Joaquin Phoenix are great in it. The movie looks great. Um, but yeah, so I love The Master. I love There'll Be Blood. Boogie Nights is a favorite also, just because I remember seeing it for the first time. I saw it in the theater in 1997 as a teenager, and it was just like, but quite an experience, like to
Yeah.
see like this, Paul Thomas Anderson was in his like early 20s when he made that movie, and like it's just like so confident and self assured, and just an incredible like experience. I love that he like takes big swings and like really is like a very ambitious filmmaker with a lot of ideas, and I love that like as he's like gotten a little older and has like kind of, as we talked about, sort of like grown into his style, he doesn't feel the need to like explain his movies
Yeah.
in the same way that he used to. Like if you go back and watch interviews with him around the time of like Boogie Nights and Magnolia, he'll straight up like tell you like what the frogs mean in Magnolia, and like he wants to like explain every detail of these films, and like he doesn't do that anymore. Like he kind of just like puts a movie out into the world and like lets people figure it out or not figure it out for themselves, and that's one of my um favorite things about him. But just, yeah, just a great filmmaker. And Phantom Thread is one of the best for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I really appreciate watching kind of his career progress, is that lack of having to explain himself. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something I'm like thinking about more and more with our current media landscape, is how we will we will drink every last drop that even tangentially relates to a piece of media. So like we have Severance on right now, and
Mhm.
White Lotus right now, and if you, there's 1,000 theories and everything has to be explained and every mistake has to be pointed out. And I think that like when you do that, you lose the 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 experience of watching that piece of media. If you're always looking for what's wrong or what's next, you're not in the moment with it. So something like this, where, as you mentioned, Paul Thomas Anderson is unapologetic, but also not, telling you every symbolism. I think that to let something just rest and a piece of media just rest is really lacking in our culture right now, that I would like
Yeah.
to see more of. I mean, we have
Yeah.
like Sex and the Cities, and then Sex and the City reboot came back, and then we have the Sex and the City podcast about the reboot. Then we have a podcast about the podcast and how the podcast was made. It's like, when do we have enough? We mine things too deep, I think.
Yeah, no, I think you're 100% right. And I think, but for me, partially, it's like, it's dependent on like the type of, like the type of media that's being dissected. Like Severance is an interesting example, because like Severance is really, I'm a big Severance fan.
Yeah.
Like Severance is like a puzzle box. Like clearly it's almost like Lost, like in a way. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
like, clearly there's like a central mystery, and you would hope like, by the end it'll all be figured out. So naturally you have people kind of like trying to figure out like where it's going to go. I think that's a natural impulse with a piece like Severance.
Mm-hmm.
With something like White Lotus, which I also really like a lot, like Mike White has taught us like how to watch that show, and we sort of like know that there are going to be certain like, certain story beats and like misdirections and reveals. And for me, like, I like to let that happen. I don't
Yeah.
need to like, I don't need to guess, like who the killer is or like who's gonna die. Like, that's like immaterial for me. That's like a hangout show. Like
Yeah.
it's like, it's just sort of about like the vibe and the, it's about the characters and like their interactions, and it's not, trying to figure out like something plot related.
Yeah.
But I think that's an excellent point, and I totally agree that like we spend way too much time, and filmmakers and creators spend too much time kind of uh like telling us what to think about something instead of letting us figure it out on our own.
Yeah, or apologizing for it too. I think that happens a lot in today's culture too. Not in a quote unquote woke way or whatever, but just to say I did this because this worked for me here. This did, and then I did this, and then I did this. And it's like, I don't need to know how the sausage is made. I just want to
Right.
enjoy my very quiet breakfast with that sausage.
Yes, for sure. That's a great note to end on, I think, is enjoying a quiet breakfast. Brett, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and talking to me about Phantom Thread, one of my very favorite movies, and Just very, very glad to finally be able to get you on a microphone to chat about it with me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to come back anytime.
We'll be doing more Paul Thomas Anderson movies this year. Part of my reasoning for doing this movie now is there's a new PTA movie it'll be in August this year, One Battle After Another, starring Leonardo DiCaprio. Kind of excited for that. We'll do other PTA movies kind of like leading up to that. And maybe we'll have you back, Brett, to talk about another one at some point down the line. But really appreciate you joining me, and we really appreciate all of you for listening to another episode of Time on Screen. Take care, and we will see you on the next episode.